Okay, we're good to go.
I'm going to let you just introduce yourself, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah. So hi, everyone. My name is Mike Haskell. I am a fourth and fifth grade, mostly a fourth and fifth grade technology and science and math teacher, a STEM teacher in Northeastern Pennsylvania. I teach 1 day a week. I teach second graders how to use iPads and how to navigate technology, but most of the time I'm a science teacher and I do math support. I think the reason why you asked me to come and speak with you is because of the first book that I co-authored, Teaching in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which I co-authored with 5 teachers from 4 different countries, all of us Global Teacher Prize finalists, looking at the impact of technology and innovation on our education system and how we can navigate that going forward. Fourth Industrial Revolution is a phrase that was coined by Klaus Schwab, who is the chairperson of the World Economic Forum. He actually wrote our foreword, but our book is the only one on the subject that I know of that is written by practitioners. 5 of us are classroom teachers, one principal from Brooklyn, Nadia Lopez, if any of you know her. And so we really looked at, from a practitioner's point of view, what does this mean for us going forward and how can our education system adapt to make sure that it meets the needs of our students in their future. Currently, right now, I have a book that is coming out in less than a month. It comes out on October 30th. Flip the System US, How Teachers Can Transform Education and Save Democracy. I edited that. It has the voices of 32 different diverse educators, mostly classroom teachers from across the United States, a couple of pretty serious international education researchers, Andy Hargraves, Pasi Sahlberg from Finland, if any of you know him, wrote chapters in there. But it looks at how our education system can be flipped so that it is driven by the collective expertise of teachers, because teachers serve at the intersection of policy and practice, and how if we can create a more inclusive education system, we can have a more inclusive and healthier democracy. So, and additionally, it was also the 2017-2018 Pennsylvania Teacher of the Year. So that's it in a nutshell. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Sure.
Now, Mark, do you want to explain a little bit about what Phi Theta Kappa has been researching?
Yes. So basically, Phi Theta Kappa has a annual project called the Honors in Action Project. And this is not just a small project, but is a big project that takes probably about a year. And the theme for the project that Phi Theta Kappa headquarters put out was to the 7th generation. And so we can either look at 7 generations ahead of us, or we could look at 3 generations behind us and see what maybe from that history would affect the 3 generations ahead of us. And so one of the sub-themes, if you would call it, that we decided to focus on was industry, craftsmanship, and trade, and how that new practices might affect the future generations based upon how we've seen newer practices in the past affecting the generations. And so one thing that we thought was very interesting to see is primarily focusing on the 4th Industrial Revolution, since it's a fairly new topic that I personally have never heard about until doing this project. You typically, it's not like it's a mainstream topic. Typically what you're hearing today in news is, about, social equality and coronavirus, which are, all good topics to be talking about, but, and obviously things going on with the election, but you're not going to hear people talking about the 4th Industrial Revolution as a Fox or CNN headline, right? And so one of the ways that we thought we could see that one of the areas we thought could very easily be affected by the 4th Industrial Revolution was obviously education. Because if it's going to affect the jobs, and if it's going to affect if it's going to destroy jobs or create new jobs and things like that, well, that works its way back to the education system. And so one of the things we're focusing on is the 4th Industrial Revolution's effect on that education system. And so being someone as yourself who has studied this more in depth and has, written material on it as well, we definitely would like to be able to hear some things from your perspective and what you've studied and what you've thought about and how the 4th Industrial Revolution is affecting education today, whether it's as high as college or as something as small as maybe elementary school. So if you could share a little bit with us about that, I think would be really
sure. Yeah, so that's someone else wanted to jump in.
Oh.
No, okay. Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack there, and I love the project that you're looking at, and I love some of the intersections of economic instability and education, and how all of that is coming together in what you're studying. And I think one of the things that I want to start talking about in the beginning is that all of the things that you mentioned that are on CNN and Fox News are absolutely driven by what's causing the fourth industrial revolution. So if you look at social justice issues, the innovation and the rise of technology is driving inequity in society. And one of the ways we know that if we step out of the myopic American view and just look at this on a global scale, I've given keynotes in Pittsburgh and in small city in Greece. I can't remember the name right now, but in both places, there's self-driving cars, self-driving buses in this Greek town, right? There's no bus drivers. Yet 17% of the world lives without electricity, right? And that technology gap is getting wider because the haves are able to create more wealth, create more political power, and the have-nots are getting left further behind, and that gap is growing. And so that's an obvious example. But as you know, the fourth industrial revolution is being driven by rapidly advancing technology, and that rapidity is getting faster and faster, right? Which means that new technologies are coming out, and each one of them comes with ethical dilemmas and with the ability to create more inequity if we're not intentional about using it for the inverse. And so, these new technologies are in the hands of people who control them, and they're driving that, right? So social justice is clearly linked to the fourth industrial revolution, but so is the coronavirus pandemic, right? If you look at the vaccines that we're developing, they're vaccines that have never been developed before, right? They're on new biological platforms. That's only possible because of our ability to crunch data and crunch numbers in ways that we couldn't before. And so all of this is built. And even though we're not using that term, fourth industrial revolution, in mainstream news or, what people are watching, technological advancement is at the basis of all of this. And so, I think everyone right now recognizes, I'm going to kind of bridge the two books that I wrote a little bit here, but everyone recognizes that we have massive social problems right now, not just in the United States, but worldwide. We tend to only see the things that are happening in the US, but what's happening here is reflected in Belarus, in Brazil, in Hungary, in Turkey. There's different places all over the world that are dealing with some of the same issues that we are. And the causes of that are both a failing of our education system and also driven by technological innovation, right? So the rise of social media, the way that people are spreading misinformation online, the divisiveness and the ability for people to have nuanced conversations. All of those are happening because in our education system, we didn't focus on giving people the tools to handle those kinds of things. Sometimes because we didn't know how to, because they hadn't been invented yet. Other times because we were focused on something else that we thought was more important as a society. I would argue that we are almost solely focused in our public education system in the United States on economic development, college and career readiness. I make the case, or actually Geert Bieste, who's a Belgian researcher, makes the case, and then we build off of it in the book that's coming out, that equally as important are making sure that children are holistically well, and that all of their needs are being met in education, and also socialization, how their self that they've developed fits into education, it fits into society as a whole. The ability to have respectful disagreement, the ability to have nuanced conversations and see complexity, the ability to just have basic human decency and see others as human beings. We don't focus on that enough in schools because we're focused on and driven by standardized tests, or driven by our need to make sure that kids have the metrics that fit in a spreadsheet so they can get into college. So all of that, and again, going back to the main theme, that college and career readiness has been driven in the past 20 years by our ability to crunch numbers and by big data, right? Standardized testing wasn't possible in the way that we do it now in the 1980s. It just wasn't, because we couldn't handle that amount of data, but now we can. And so it's been used for purposes that I think weren't nefarious at first. I think there was probably good motives, positive motives behind it, but over time got corrupted, like things often do in systems that aren't built well. So there's a long rambling answer that touched on a whole lot of different things. So feel free to shoot any questions my way and then I'll try and explain things better.
You know, I might say that even in college today, we're being pushed to be more data driven, definitely. And so I agree, and that what you had said about how we need to begin, if we want change, it needs to begin earlier.
Yeah,
Definitely.
yeah, I think that's true. So I think, and the book that's coming out is almost solely focused on our K-12 education system. But I do think there's a lot of applications for higher ed. And let's dig into that data driven for a second, because I think this is a really important point. I agree, we should be data driven. I come from a math background. I was a presidential award winner for math teaching. Like, I love spreadsheets. I'm all about data. I think the problem we have in education is that we use data that is the easiest to obtain, the cheapest to obtain, and it's, quite frankly, lousy data, right? We're making the most important decisions in education based on whether or not kids had breakfast in the morning. It's a stupid way of running an education system, whether it's in college or K-12. We need to, if we really want to be data driven in a way that's effective, we need to get to not just quantitative data that fits in a spreadsheet nicely. We need to get to qualitative data. We need to get to the lived experiences of the people that we're trying to serve, right? And that's our students. If we can't understand the lived experiences of the communities and the kids that are sitting in front of us in our school, then we can't serve them properly. And part of that, quite frankly, comes down to making sure that our teaching population, whether it's K-12 or in universities, is reflective of the students that are sitting in the chairs in front of us. Because how can we, let's face it, in K-12, it's, we're a majority white middle-class female teaching force, right? That's not what our kids look like. Unless we bring in diverse perspectives, we're not going to understand the lived experiences of those. We have to be intentional about that. And so mixing that quantitative data that's easy to obtain and easy to crunch and easily fits in a spreadsheet with that qualitative data that gets us to the lived experiences of our students we need to be focusing on both of those things if we want to make a difference.
I know Cassie might be able to ask this question in a different way than I am, but I did look at the chapter in the book on education in a time of unprecedented change. And some of the examples that really promoted students' creative thinking and problem solving, which I know that we all wish that we had time for. Mm-hmm. How do you meet all of the requirements of education while also, providing opportunities for that? Yeah,
I love this question. It's one I get a lot, and I just love when I get it because I think the answer is so incredibly important. I don't think we have to choose either or. I don't think it's a matter of time. I don't think that anything I'm advocating for in that chapter or that I've spoken about is something that we should do on top of everything else that we do. I think we need to do things differently and not in addition. Since we're talking about technology, right? And in that chapter, there's a great Venn diagram, the one where I say, in order for us to meet the needs of the fourth industrial revolution, our schools, of course, need to be rooted, or at least need to be technologically relevant, right? If kids are coming to school and they're not seeing any technology, it's not reflective of the world outside of our school. They're not going to believe that we're relevant. But at the same time, we need to keep education rooted in the things that are most important: relationships, empathy, humanity, compassion. And in the same way that we need to look at technological tools that we use in the classroom and say, okay, are these tools chosen because they're going to deliver content best, or are we choosing them because they help us fulfill that mission of building relationships, making kids are well, and in addition, bringing the content in at the same time. And so, we're often taught in our pre-service teaching classes, and I know that I certainly was when I was in university in the 90s, that we start with the curriculum and then we find great ways to teach it. And I think that is absolutely backwards. I think that you start with experiences that make kids want to beat down the doors of your classroom to get in. And then it's our job as professional teachers to embed the curriculum into those experiences, right? And I think that's what you see in that first chapter, right? You have teachers that, whether it's Bajal in India creating this bazaar that where they're going to sell things to empower girls to be able to get an education, right? That was her basic. She started with that experience because her kids were so passionate about it. And then she taught entrepreneurship and business skills and how to balance a checkbook and all of those things that were in her curriculum through that thing that kids were passionate about because they were making a difference and helping others. And I think that's the way to do it. For me, it tends to happen through virtual field trips and experiences where I connect classrooms, right? That tends to fit. And quite frankly, that came from me growing up on Long Island in an amazingly diverse community and having friends from all different ethnic backgrounds. And then moving to Northeastern Pennsylvania in a small town where it's 97% white, right? So now that I teach in my hometown, I wanted to bring some of those experiences that were so rich and so amazing for me as a kid to my students. So once technology made it possible and free and easy to do, we started going on virtual field trips and meeting other classes. And my kids were excited about that and they wanted more of it. So I found ways to build the curriculum into those things that they were demanding that they wanted more of, right? And then that led to, as you read, different service projects and me building engineering into, the engineering process into a bridge that they wanted to build. That all came, the curriculum all got embedded into the things that they were passionate about. And it's not something that happens every day in my classroom. I don't teach my entire curriculum that way. But it's certainly a significant enough portion that the relevance is clear to students. I don't have to tell them one day you'll use this when you graduate school. They know the relevance because they're using the content to make a difference in the lives of others, when they're doing those projects in my classroom.
That's what I was thinking, the project problem-based approach, interdisciplinary approach. So it sounds like that's what you were hitting on. May I ask another question?
Yeah, of course.
Interesting. I hope this is relevant. So I've been attending the Indiana State Teachers Association. They have a conference and it's been in the afternoons from 6 to 8. So there's another session tonight. But I have been interested in kind of the early educators. And this isn't just this year. This is most of the years I try to go to that panel and hear what the new teachers, their first, second, third, fifth year-ish. And overwhelmingly, the topic they keep bringing up is, and this connects to your piece about social emotional for the kids, because I tell my students as teachers, it's like 50-50, 50% academics, 50% social emotional. You've got to be doing both. But it's self-care because the teachers are so bogged down with everything. I'm not sure I'm saying that eloquently, but kind of what are your thoughts on that piece? Because I think, yes, we want the kids to have it, but we've got to model it and have it ourselves, right, in order to help the kids be in that good place.
Yeah, and I think that this conversation is more important this year than it ever has been before. I think it's always been, so there's two ways of looking at this, and one is incredibly damaging to teachers, and you've all seen the meme going around social media at one time or another, and that's like, a teacher is like a candle, consumes itself to, light others or whatever. Like, that's terror, that's awful. That's basically telling teachers, like, go kill yourself for your students, and it's not healthy, right? And look, those of us that have been in the classroom, we've all been there at one time or another where, we've been at that point where we're just so emotionally spent that we're worthless to our families, to our students, to anyone else. I tend to like another analogy, and that's you can't pour from an empty cup, right? And I think that's what you're saying right now. Self-care is incredibly important. And my wife would be the first to tell you that I do a terrible job at this at times, right? I burn myself out. But we have to focus as a profession, and this is actually there's actually a chapter that speaks to this in the book that's coming out in Flip the System, on what we need to do to support teachers to make sure that their needs are being met so that they can help their students. And of course, I'm going to go back to what I said before, so I can, for me, I've run 8 half marathons and I'm better when I'm running. I haven't in a while, but I know that that's one thing that's good for me when I can find the time to be able to do it. Getting out and running, I can clear my head and do that. But for everyone, it's different. But we also have to understand that certain teachers who come from oppressed communities have a tougher time because the community in their school is not as supportive as it might be for me as a straight white American male, in a faculty room. And so we need to not only make sure that teachers are taking care of themselves, but we need to make sure that the teaching community and our school communities are taking care of every member that's in that school to make sure that they're well. And that in a lot of ways can't be done from the teacher level, right? Because culture is determined by leadership. And so you need school leadership that is willing to create an environment and create a culture where everyone in that school is taken care of, from the teachers to the students to the bus drivers to the cafeteria workers to everybody, in order for that to be sustainable.
Yeah, add too, and this connects back to your technology piece. Things such as simple as having email on our phones, right? Like that's the examples I was hearing over and over again. Teachers are looking at emails, they're seeing something at 10:30 at night before they go to bed, and they're worried about it all night. They can't sleep, so it's like healthy boundaries, I think, with technology. And as you just said, with leadership, right? Helping that be okay could be a piece to the puzzle.
Yeah. What a difference it would be between a principal that says, like, make sure you get the job done, and we're here to serve your students. So, like, don't leave anything unanswered. And a principal that says, look, when you leave here at 3:30 or 4 o'clock, you take care of you, right? And everything can wait. You make sure you take care of you and you come back fresh and ready to go in the morning. I think that sends two totally different messages to teachers, and one of them is a lot healthier. Yeah. Yeah, Sean, go ahead.
Okay, so I've from what I'm processing, I feel like that you're really positioning to advocate for the humanity of our children, because there's a real agenda in the ego or the greed of the fourth industrial revolution to produce at a level that it doesn't account for our stress level. It's similar back to when it's basically a technological form of everything that happened in the past. When we had 6 and 8 year olds working 12, 14-hour days on their feet, their back was breaking down, they were dying. It's that same similar setup, just technologically. So what I'm my concern is, or what is the application if teachers as a whole have always been underpaid and undervalued and kind of kept down from voicing their opinion or having momentum? How is the dynamic of the teacher you're presenting from your book going to be able to rise up?
Yeah, fantastic question. And actually, I think there's two different questions in there, so I'm going to take them both separately. The first point about humanity, I think you're absolutely right? And so when we look at the fourth industrial revolution, it's being driven by technological innovation. Innovation at its core comes from the engineering design process, right? So as a STEM teacher, that's something I teach my kids, right? So you start with a problem, and then you go through the engineering design process to research and brainstorm and come up with a possible solution, and then you test that iteration, and then you try and make it better, right? So we go through that process. But if we insert humanity and empathy into that design process, and we start with not just what's the problem, but what are the connected problems? Who are the people who are impacted? Right? When I start developing a solution, what are the unintended consequences to certain segments of the population when I put that in place, right? And we even start with a problem that, instead of the motive of that problem being like, how do we, if it's purely a entrepreneurial class, right, where we're learning business, profit is the motive, right? But what if we started, instead of profit as the motive, as solving some kind of social issue, closing some kind of equity gap, making the world better for someone else, right? If we started with that as the problem and went through that design process and used the technology that was available to us and invented things to support that, I think that leads us to a more inclusive, a more peaceful, a better society going forward. And so I think that's the first piece, and I think you hit it perfectly, right? Inserting humanity into that process is key, right? And so I want that in education, right? I think that's what education should be. As to the second piece, the systemic piece, right? Like, that's really the book that's coming out now. And I think you're right. So what we have right now in education is a top-down hierarchy, right? So if you think about it, everything starts at the federal level. The federal government uses levers to coerce the states to do certain things. The states then coerce school districts. School district administrators coerce principals. Principals coerce teachers, and then teachers are usually guilty of coercing kids, right? That's the system that we have right now, and it's coercive, and it's top down, and it's brutal. And I think everyone recognizes that, right? So what I'm advocating for in Flip the System is a flattened hierarchy that is based on inspiration and support rather than coercion, right? So it starts with, and I'm going to say that teachers, I said before, teachers need to be driving education decisions, right? The collective expertise of teachers. But that doesn't mean that teachers aren't looking to the community and to their students and saying, what do you need to be successful, right? So I think teachers are the only stakeholders in that system that can advocate collectively for what kids need, right? Parents can advocate for their own students, they should. Students can advocate for themselves, but teachers really see a wide variety of needs, and that's why they're so important in the system, right? But it starts, that flip that we're talking about starts with administrators saying to teachers, what do you need to be successful and how can I give it to you? Instead of being coercive. And, once we get that as teachers, we do the same thing to our students, right? And then administrators demand the same thing of the district leaders, right? Them saying, what do you need to be successful as a principal? And then district leaders expect the same from the state saying, as a district, what do you need to be successful? And that's how we start changing the system, right? Now, people in power want to consolidate it and want to keep it, right? So this is not an easy change. Just saying that it should happen doesn't mean that it's going to. And that's why there has to be, don't ever let a teacher say, my job is not political, or I'm not politically engaged, or I don't care about politics. The fact of the matter is you're in a position that every action that you take in your classroom is developing future citizens. So the textbook you use, the pedagogical method you use, the choices you make, all of that is a political decision, right? So you don't get to not be political and be a teacher. Your job is literally funded by tax dollars, right? You are political. So you bet your rear end that you better be out there advocating for a better system and for your students, because if you're not doing it, someone else is going to get what they think is right for your students or what they think is right for the system. And you're the one that knows. You're the one that knows that intersection between policy and practice. So it better be your voice out there. Tell that story, or someone else is going to tell it for you.
Thank you.
I'd like to change direction just a little bit.
Sure.
Mark and Sean are both going to be graduating from a community college. I know that Mark's goal is to go directly to work. Sean, are you planning on transferring or going directly to work? Transferring? Okay. So with what you do know about the fourth industrial revolution, do you see some of the same fears that others have in how their jobs may very well be impacted by what's going on and what they're studying and what they're getting probably ready to graduate? Yeah,
so I wouldn't say fear. I want to take that out, because I think for both of you not yet in the workforce, there's not as much fear as someone who's already in there, right? I remember a couple years ago, I was asked, when I was working as a curriculum coach, I was asked by a high school calculus teacher, can you put us in touch with an actuary, because it's a really high paying job. We're in a rural area. That's something where our AP Calc students can aspire for. And I brought in this actuary, and they talked to students, and it was great, right? But as I started researching for T4IR, for the Teaching in the Fourth Industrial Revolution book, being an actuary is not only high paying, it's also something that is incredibly automatable, right? And so, it's a job that if you're an actuary right now, you're making bank, but who knows how long your job is going to be there. So I think people in the workforce have more to fear than you do. What I will say is all of the research out there, whether it's the World Economic Forum or OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, all of the research out there is that the most important job skills for 2030 and beyond are social skills. It's empathy, it's compassion, it's emotional intelligence. That's what's needed going forward. And so all of this nonsense that we have in K-12 education about college and career readiness being kids being able to fill in a bubble on a math test, it's insane. It's nothing that kids need. We're literally spending our focus on things that all of the people who are looking at the job market going forward are telling us are not as important as the things that we're not focused on. I can tell you, I have 23 years of being a teacher. I've never had a faculty meeting on how to develop emotional intelligence in kids. And it's the #1 skill that kids need, right? So the fact that, Sean, that you asked that question before, and that, Mark, you're looking at this, I think you're in great shape. I think that you're you are exhibiting the very skills that are going to be looked for in the job market. Something that's crazy. I went to the University of Scranton, which is a liberal Jesuit liberal arts school, right? And the big joke at the time in the 90s when I graduated is that if you graduated with like a liberal arts degree or a communications degree or a philosophy degree, that you you basically blew your money for 4 years. But right now, a liberal arts degree is about the best thing that you can have in the job market, because it shows that you know how to think, and you can think critically, and all of those skills that we talked about are important. So yeah, I think you're on the right track. I don't think there's a lot of need for fear. And what you say in your interview, how you exhibit that, whether you're going to another college or whether you're going to the job market, I think both of you are going to represent yourself really well.
I think I have a useful question. Leslie, you can pop in if you don't think it is, or kind of veer me in the right direction. So I believe that I'm going to consult with this group and kind of walk them through the traditional elements of a lesson plan, because they're going to work with a class and teach something. I don't think they've decided on what that something is, but what I think I hear you saying is the social emotional type of something would be a good focus. So do you have any ideas for them?
Yeah, so
I love Daniel Goleman in emotional intelligence. You probably know that name.
Yeah, sure. So I don't think that just like technology can be integrated with humanity, I think that that we do a disservice when we disconnect social emotional skills and trauma informed practices from the curriculum, right? I think those things can be done at the same time. And so if I go back to like some of the examples that are in the book, my kids, so there was a statistic given to me by an assistant superintendent in my district maybe 8 or 9 years ago, that 1 in 4 of our students go home to a family where one of their parents is codependent on drugs or alcohol, right? So 25%. We're over 60% poverty in our community. So you can imagine when kids come to school, like in a lot of other places, sometimes they've had a rough time, they're lacking hope, right? I can say that I've seen that in my students. But allowing them to go through problem-based lessons or project-based lessons where the outcome is that they made a difference in the lives of others, whether it's building a bridge in Mukuyuni in Kenya, whether it's the Children Against Child Labor campaign, where we had a group of 4th graders that partnered with kids in India who were researching the same topic to put together a social media campaign. When they see the impact of those kinds of projects and they understand their value as humans to be able to take learning and apply it to make the life of someone else better, like they know that they matter. They know why they're coming to school. That social emotional piece is built into it. And so I think social emotional learning and relevance are really closely tied together, but real relevance, not the relevance where like, hey, one day you're going to need this in your life, but like real, where they feel like the learning is relevant to them. I think that can be incredibly empowering. So I think when we design lessons, we really need to keep both of those things in mind, right? And I think every teacher should be able to answer, why are we learning this? And have an answer that is not something that's 15 years in the future. It should be like, why are we learning this? Because what are we going to do with it right now? So if I'm teaching the scientific method, I better be teaching that in the context of an experiment, rather than like, hey, this is something that, you need to memorize these steps. Yeah.
Other questions?
I have a question. I've been doing a lot of reading lately for a class I've been taking, and I just happened to run across this today, and I thought of your book and what we've been talking about this whole year with the students with the project, and didn't know if it actually does correlate, or am I off base with this? But it's I'm looking at the article right now, or the book, and it's talking about the semantic web, or Web 3.0. And it's just talking about combining your personal taste and interest with advances in computer intelligence. So I feel like that's what we've kind of been talking about, that differentiates IR4 with IR3, because that was such a technology age as well. And it seemed that people were really fearful that computers are going to take over our jobs and so forth. So I feel like this is the connection that, like you mentioned, maybe is starting with good intentions of putting a humanistic form, or maybe being more universal or inclusive, and everybody having a say. in what we do with that technology that's coming?
Yeah. So I'll admit up front, I know those terms, but I don't know a lot about them. So I don't want to speak to them specifically, but I think I got the gist of your question. So first, the fears that we hear now in the fourth industrial revolution about technology taking jobs, that's not new. That same narrative was there in the 1920s, 1930s, right? There's always been a fear that technological innovation was going to change the job market. And the other thing that we often hear is that, we're preparing kids for jobs that don't exist yet. Again, that's always been true, right? Like, that's not new now. Those are just things that are being used to drive certain narratives. Now we can say that it's advancing more rapidly than it ever has before. I think that's legitimate. But just acknowledging that this is what education is, right? Education is preparing kids for an unknown future. It always has been. But to your other points, and I kind of lost my train of my train of thought there a little bit. So pull me back if you want to. But this idea that that innovation is going to prepare kids for what they need, and that it's going to be disruptive, right? I think that's really what we're talking about, is disruption, right? That's not a bad thing if we disrupt things in the right way, because there's going to be disruption no matter what, right? Like, that's just what happens in life. And as educators, we have the ability to shape the next generation in ways that most other professions don't. And so instilling the democratic norms and democratic values that we have always held as Americans into children in the education system is something that's critical and will serve them well as they move into this highly technological, highly innovation driven society. And so, equality, liberty, making sure that there's a balance, right? So I write about this a little bit in the new book. There's always been this struggle between those two terms, right? And you can't have all of one, right? Complete liberty is anarchy. It literally means everybody can do whatever they want without looking at the rights of others, right? And complete equality takes such an authoritative control from the government that there's no liberty at all, right? To mandate complete equality. And so the question for us as a democratic society, as Americans, is, where do we draw the line? And as we're making that decision in our system, it has to be driven by compassion and empathy and humanity. And that's where our role as educators comes in, is helping kids understand that balance. And quite frankly, so many of our classrooms and schools are set up to be completely undemocratic. All of our mission statements say that we want to create good citizens and contributing members of society, and kids are not even allowed to be democratic members of their own classroom or their own school. They're not going to magically graduate at 18 and have these skills, right? Their classroom, they have to have the ability to have choice and to make decisions, and to have those decisions be wrong and to learn from them. That's got to be part of what we do in our schools. So I don't know if that answered your question at all, Melanie, but but I got off on a tangent, so there we go. Right?
It helped. I think that you're speaking to the point that I'm hoping that we can use this for, in that if we can use it and put a humanness to it, instead of making it so robotic and things like that, then we would have good intentions going forward.
Sure. And I mean, so artificial intelligence, we haven't really touched on, right? But that's a huge part of the fourth industrial revolution. Every artificial intelligence is programmed by humans who are biased, because all of us are biased, right? That's not a not a knock. That's just a trait of humanity, right? And so those biases end up in the computer code, and whether it's AI or whether it's any other program. And so we have to be intentional about making sure that we're checking for that, right? So an example is, if you look at policing, right? So law enforcement wanted to be more effective, and so they created computer programs that would tell them where crime was going to happen, so they could deploy more police officers. But of course, what ended up happening is that more police officers were deployed to areas that were more Black, more Hispanic, poorer, low socioeconomic. And so more arrests happened in those areas. Crimes were being committed in other more affluent areas where there was no police and people got away with it, right? And so what ended up happening is more and more police were deployed, more and more crimes were caught, and the property values dropped. and you ended up with making the situation worse when you were trying to make it better, right? And then when it came to sentencing, computer programs were written to predict whether or not people would commit further crimes, and then their sentences were based on those computer programs. And of course, people who were of certain ethnicities, certain people who were of certain economic stature, those things are predictive, not because they necessarily there's something innate about those people that makes them more likely to commit crime, but their circumstances do, right? And the circumstances are pushed on them by the system. And so these biases in the computer programs ended up leading to the opposite outcomes that we were hoping for. And so when we're developing artificial intelligence, when we're developing programs, which we will, because that's just the way the world works right now. And I mean, heck, we could talk about YouTube and Facebook and social media and the election and QAnon and false conspiracy theory. Like, we can get into all of that. It's all based on the same thing, that computer programs are driving how we act right now in society. And we're doing a terrible job of understanding that impact as citizens, and of checking for it as people who are the people who are running the system, checking for it and making sure that it doesn't have negative impacts.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah, Mark.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
So I've been just writing rapidly, so I've just been letting everyone else ask the great questions. But here's a question that was on my mind as you were talking here at the start, is you mentioned that schools haven't given the children the tools they need in order to accurately handle this rapidly progressing technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so it just, when you're thinking about, we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution, and there's been so many technological advancements that's come before it now. Mm-hmm. The car is one of them, right? Mm-hmm. There was a time when the automobile was a technological advancement, so to speak. And what do we have now in our school systems that we offer children? We offer driver's ed, right? There is a new technology, right, and we teach our kids how to not just like, oh, well, here's the gas, here's the brake, here's the steering wheel, have at it. Mm-hmm. But we're like, here are the rules. Here's how you can use it. Here's how you can use it responsibly. Here's how you can use it appropriately, right? So here we have a rapidly growing era that we are in of technology, and social media is practically, it is the spearhead of it all in my mind. So I guess this is kind of a rhetorical question about, why are we not teaching kids how to accurately handle this new technology? But rather, I guess my question to you is, in what ways, as you being a teacher, can teachers teach our children how to accurately handle this new technology like social media? Not just how to make sure, we're not offensive and things like that, but like, look, here's how we can be positive with our social media. Yep. Instead of it just being a matter of entertainment, how can we positively use this new technology?
Yeah. So yes, I'm going to definitely answer that question, but I also don't think that your previous question should be rhetorical. I think that that's a legitimate question. Why are we not doing this? And I'm going to start there, because I think one of the reasons, well, there's two things that I can think of. The first is that when technology was advancing and the car came out, technology was advancing at a pace where we could keep up in education. And we can't right now. We can't. Things are moving so fast. The human knowledge doubles, Moore's law every 18 months, give or take. People argue whether or not that's accurate, but I think the premise is legit, right? And so we have to stop trying in education. We're not going to keep up with new technologies. What we have to do is give kids the values that will allow them to make those ethical decisions in their lives, right? So I think that if you understand the impact of technology on how people are manipulated, and you are a naturally empathetic person who can see things from other people's point of view, understand their perspective, put yourself in their shoes, all of those things that empathy means, right? And there's different kinds of empathy that we could go into. But if you have that skill set, you're naturally going to be able to navigate the world of social media better, right? So I think that's the first thing. We have to start with what values we're giving kids in our education system. But as for how we can do that, right, specifically social media, I think the first step is don't ban it, right? Like, the fact that like Twitter is blocked in some schools is insane, right? We need to, just like you said, we need to start at a young age showing kids how to use social media for good rather than evil. Right. And I think in my own career, I'm connected with thousands of educators from all over the world. And I can tell you, so I've been blessed to, be a Global Teacher Prize finalist and a Teacher of the Year. I was really good at being a mediocre teacher for the first 10 years of my career. I was a high school girls soccer coach, and I love doing that. I don't coach anymore, but I still have really fond memories, and I'm in touch with some of my soccer players that played for me. If you came into my classroom during those first 10 years, my kids would have been sitting in rows. I had good classroom management. I think I was doing an okay job. I had no classroom empowerment. Right, my kids were not getting anything special out of my class. They were learning basic math and reading and moving on to the next grade level. I think what changed for me is I ended up, for a long story that I can tell you over a beer sometime, but I ended up in a session at a conference on how to build your professional learning network for all the wrong reasons. But it spoke to me, and I started connecting with teachers outside of my school and learning from people. And I had the thought early on, I remember this, saying to myself, there are teachers in other places that are doing incredible things for their students. I love my students, and they deserve better than what I'm giving them right now. Right. And that thought that spurred everything that came afterwards, all of these things that I tried in my classroom, these innovative things that I developed, none of that would have happened if I didn't have that thought. And that thought would have never happened if I didn't have the ability on social media to connect with other people and to learn from them. Our students deserve that same experience. Right. That's what learning should be. And so by blocking social media and not teaching them how to navigate that world for good, we're robbing them of the opportunity to have that same kind of aha moment and that same kind of learning experience. And so we should have, classrooms should have social media accounts where they're sharing the amazing work that students are doing in a way that, of course, protects privacy and all of those things that and by the way, that gives us the opportunity to have that conversation with students, right? Why do we need to protect your privacy? What are things that we can put out? What shouldn't we put out, right? If we're not doing, if we don't have real experiences, those relevant experiences that we talked about before, that are relevant in the moment, then it's just another class that we're going to spew stuff that's coming out of a teacher's mouth that nobody cares about and will be forgotten in a half hour, right? It's got to be relevant in the moment, and certainly we should be doing that with social media. So hopefully that answered your question.
Any other questions?
I have one, and again, if it's too far off topic, just veer me back in. So how do you think the money piece, like the funding and all of this, has an interplay?
Yeah, that is not a topic that is far off at all. I think that is integrally, I mean, that's intimately intertwined with everything that we're talking about, right? So we are in a society that is driven by profit and money. And that has filtered into our education system. I don't think anyone would make an argument differently. And I think a great example of this is personalized learning, which is just a terrible term because it is learning that is totally impersonal, right? What it has come to mean is that we purchase computer programs, right? And this is how we bring it back to the Fourth Industrial Revolution. And by the way, Armin Doucet has his chapter in the book is phenomenal on this. It's all about personalized learning. But schools buy computer programs that they stick kids in front of that have no social emotional benefit, that are kids are literally looking at a screen, and a computer is deciding based on their answers, based on an algorithm that was produced, what content they will get next, right? And somehow that impersonal experience where they don't have a teacher anymore that understands their needs, that totally impersonal experience is personalized learning. Why is that being pushed on schools? Because someone's making money off of it. It's a terrible education practice, right? It's now the software company is making money, right? It's beneficial to certain segments of the population that are financially driven because you don't need as many teachers now, right? So you're taking away teachers that actually provide benefit, social emotional benefit, and are able to understand that qualitative data that we talked about before, right? All of those are economic decisions rather than decisions on what's best for kids. And this is why teachers, the collective expertise of teachers, has to be driving education system, has to be driving the decisions in our education system. If we allow teacher input to drive those decisions, you will avoid the unintended consequences. Because I guarantee you that there are lawmakers who are making decisions that are hearing about this and saying, that's fantastic. We can have a computer determine what comes next, right? It meets the curriculum, the state standards that we passed, like giddy up, let's go. right? What they don't understand is all the things that are going to go wrong because they don't have teachers at the table that are speaking to them. And so we have to find ways to create structures and create systems where that expertise of teachers is not just in the conversation, but is driving those conversations.
That's awesome. What about like the digital divide piece though, and the money, kind of where is it going to come from, I guess?
Yeah. So the United States does not have a terrible education system. What we have is a terribly inequitable education system, right? So from having spent a lot of time in a lot of countries and from spending time with teachers all over the world, when we talk about the best education of the world, it is still in American schools. There's no doubt about it. And as a matter of fact, if you look at the breakdown of schools and how they perform, American schools that have a very low poverty percentage absolutely kick the snot out of other countries that have the same percentage of poverty across the board. When you look at the next tier down, so between like 10 and 20% poverty, and you compare those schools in the United States to schools in other places that have between 10 and 20% poverty, we kick the snot out of them, right, on test scores, which are a terrible metric. But you can go all the way down and look at every one of those demographic breakups, and we are fantastic. The problem is that we have a higher percentage of kids living in poverty than any other industrialized education system in the world. And the way that we fund schools is so highly inequitable that we have schools that are the best in the world, and we have schools that are performing worse than schools in, name a third world country or country in the global south, I guess is the term that we're using now. We don't use third world anymore. So the question becomes not how do we provide more resources, although I certainly think more resources would help. It's how do we provide those resources equitably within our education system. And so school funding formulas absolutely matter. And I think when we look at this in a global context as well, we often look and say, well, the United States spends so much more per student than other countries. How come we don't get better outcomes? Well, inequity is part of it, but also American schools provide things that no other schools in the world provide. Whether it's transportation or high school football teams or whatever, right? Those costs are not associated with schools in most other places in the world. And so we have to look at what our priorities are. And if we want all of those things, then we've got to pay for them. Then if we need to make sure that we are putting our money where it's most important, both in terms of equity and in terms of priorities in our schools.
Lisa, you had a question?
Apologize. My voice is going to sound weird. I have a lot of allergy issues.
No worries.
But you kind of hit on something that really, my biggest fear right now is prior to COVID, we had a teacher shortage.
Mm-hmm.
I think that COVID is going to cause it to get 10 times worse because who's going to want to jump in this?
Yep.
And you kind of hit on that with a little bit where this is going, but I think that we need more teachers. We need more diverse teachers, but I can't figure out how we're going to encourage people to be able to do this because I think it's going to become an even bigger issue.
Yeah, I agree with you, but I'm going to give you an optimistic answer, right? So
Yay.
first the negative. And by the way, I am totally stealing. So again, flip the system, right? The book that's coming out. I'm totally going to steal some of this stuff from Kimberly Eckert in her chapter. And if you want to see, I did a great interview with her. If you go to my YouTube channel or on Facebook, it's there because I'm doing interviews with all of the authors right now. So you can hear this right out of her mouth, some of the stuff that's being said. And she's phenomenal. She was a Louisiana Teacher of the Year. She's a Global Teacher Prize finalist. She's awesome. The bad news is exactly what you said, right? We already had a teacher shortage, and that was driven not necessarily by pay, although teacher pay is something that came up, and healthcare benefits and all of that. But the number one thing that was driving people out of the profession is a lack of autonomy and agency. And I know this firsthand from going around as Teacher of the Year. I went all over Pennsylvania speaking to college kids and pre-service teachers, and they all had this incredible optimism and enthusiasm. They couldn't wait to become teachers. They wanted to change the world. All of the reasons why I chose to become a teacher also, right? But if you talk to just about any teacher who's been in the profession 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever, and you ask them, what are you doing this week? Their answer has nothing to do with why they chose to be a teacher in the first place. So we've disconnected the things that they cared about from what their job is. And once that happens, you get disenfranchised. You have no say to change the system, right? Other than getting highly political, and you don't have the energy for that because the system is sucking your energy out in all of the ways that Cassie mentioned before, right? And so that disconnect is forcing teachers to leave, and it's only getting worse under COVID. You're absolutely right about that. Here's the good news. It's an easy fix if we decide to, as a society, go forward with it. Because Generation Z, studies have shown that Generation Z, the kids that are in high school right now, are looking for the opportunity to make a difference in the world, and to change society for the better, and to close equity gaps, and to be focused on social justice. All of the things that teachers are perfectly positioned to do, that Generation Z, study after study shows that that's what they want in their career. The problem is that no one has shown them that teaching is the way to do it yet. And that's Kimberly's, like, that's her mission in Louisiana. She is working on grow your own programs in schools, and having high school programs that are identifying kids and saying, you should be a teacher. But if we do that, this is fixable. We just have to make sure that we make that connection. We fix the systemic problems that we have that disconnect why teachers chose to teach with what they're actually being asked to do in the classroom. But we've got a generation that is ready to step in and do the work.
That is good news.
Yes, it is.
And you know, we have some teachers on here. I know, Mark and Sean may not be planning to be teachers,
You can still
but
change your mind. It's cool.
yeah. But, talking with you has just made me realize that no matter what our career, ethics, social justice, emotional intelligence, those are all things that we can bring to the job and make a big difference no matter what we decide to do.
I think that's absolutely correct, and very well said. Yeah, I think it's our job as citizens in a democratic society to make sure that we are leaving our country, our world, our communities better than we found them. I totally agree with that.
Well, I'm already thinking about what can I do differently in some of my classes. I don't know about some of you, but thank you so much, Michael. We really appreciate this.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and it was a great conversation. I was exhausted after teaching second graders all day, but now I'm enthusiastic and ready to rock. So you guys were awesome. Yeah, this was fantastic.
Thank you. Oh,
Really enjoyed this. Thank
Mark,
you.
did you have something?
Yes, and if I may ask you just one more question.
Yeah, of course. Sure.
And something that it didn't really occur to me until later on in the conversation was we're talking about kids, right? We're not talking about primarily like people my age who are 21 years old. I mean, we're talking about high school, elementary age. And I guess one thing that's just maybe this is not an answerable question. Maybe this is just kind of like a question that should be put out there. But do you think that there is a possible issue of exposing the innocence of childhood because of technological advancement? And we're talking about social media being so accessible. We're talking about so many things on YouTube being accessible. I mean, there's a lot of things which, when you figure out the age rate of which children are exposed to certain things is getting lower and lower and lower because technology is getting better and better and better. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not talking about primarily the concern of them understanding about social equality, because that's important, right? But at what point is there a possibility of exposing the innocence of them worrying about, what's going on politically in government and all these other things when they're only 6 years old, and the best and the thing that they should be able to do at that age is just worry about being, a good person, being a kid who's friends and who wants to go and play and learn, and there's an innocence, right? There's an innocence of childhood. And so is there a possible concern that we expose these kids through this new technology, this rapidly advancing technology, before we really even should?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's absolutely a concern. And so there's a couple of thoughts that I have with that. First is that I don't think we have to worry about children being exposed to social justice early. They know it better than we do. Right. And you want proof? Sit 3 preschoolers down at a table and give one of them 3 cookies and the other 2 none, and see what happens. Right. I mean, like, they understand social justice at a young age. Right. And they know fairness. Right. Like, they understand those concepts. But as for like what social media and YouTube and those kinds of things do to our young people at certain ages, I absolutely think this is an important conversation, and it's a conversation for us to have collectively, right? Because right now those industries are basically unregulated. And the reason for that is going back to what we said before, it's driven by profit, right? And so there should absolutely be a societal conversation for us, as Americans to say, what should the guidelines be, right? Like at what level, what should we be shielding kids from, right? So there's laws, if you're, 13, I think is the age of consent for COPA, right? We have COPA compliance or whatever. But, right now you can start with, a Mickey Mouse video and let the algorithm play, and you walk away from your kid and an hour later they're watching things that you don't want them to be seeing, right? So that algorithm is being built to put certain videos in front of certain people, and no one's being held accountable for that, right? Like you as a parent are now like supposed to guard that for your kids, but what is the responsibility of the company in making sure that happens? And so I think those conversations you bring up, Mark, are incredibly important conversations. And we just have not, as a society, started to wrestle with them yet. And I think we should. A great podcast, I'm going to give a plug for looking at this situation. It's by the New York Times. It's called The Rabbit Hole. Oh my God. 9 episodes that will it's phenomenal. And I listened to it with my son, who's now a freshman. We went and did some backpacking back in, I guess it was May or whatever. And on the way up to where we were going, we listened to it in the car. It was so powerful and so phenomenal, and it speaks exactly to this, Mark. Not necessarily how we should be regulating, but exactly what this is doing, not just to kids, but to anyone that's being manipulated by these algorithms. And I think that's a great place to start, because once we recognize what's happening, we can start to say, how do we fix it? What regulations do we put in there? And yeah, there was a question. Can we ask more questions? Go for it. Yeah.
Dawn has a question. Yeah.
No one's home. My wife is food shopping, and my kids aren't home from cross country practice yet. So it's go for it. It's all good.
So what I hear is being said is we have to develop a conscience of emotional health and care. But in that same mindset, I mean, I did a study on the Zabaleen. It's a people in Egypt who are ostracized because they handle the trash, and their education has totally changed to accommodate their business. Mm-hmm. They're not taught basic education. They're taught to handle contracts and how to be safe, and that's their educational core. So in the midst of us understanding that there is a revolution coming and in the making, while we can't adapt to or keep up with all of the technology, would you be able to identify a core of things that you would say are most needful for anyone going into that? From which you can kind of a paradigm for the new positioning of the technology.
Yeah. So if I hear you, Sean, I think the question revolves around how do we, and this is not how you framed it, but I think this is what you're trying to get at in some ways. How do we keep education locally relevant with some degree of local control, so the communities are getting what they need out of an education system that they fund, while also making sure that our education system makes us more cohesive as a society and allows us to instill the kind of values that we need to have a functioning democracy as a country, right? And this is a really important question, because I was doing some work on STEM education with OECD, with the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, back in 2017. I was in Paris there, and I had a conversation that has stuck with me. I've mentioned this in a bunch of interviews. One of the researchers there told me that they've found that if you live in a rural area of the United States, you have more in common in your lived experience with someone living in rural Romania than you do someone living in New York City. Right. And so we have these two totally different experiences, and a whole bunch of other experiences, right? If you're living in the suburbs, it's totally different too. You have these totally different experiences, and all of those people think that their experience is the American experience. And in a way they all are, and in a way they're all not, right? And so how do we become more cohesive? And I think it starts with those values that we talked about before. If you have empathy, if you have the ability to understand others' perspectives, and if we give kids the opportunity in school to work with and develop solutions with people who are very different than them, whether they're international or domestic, we give them the capacity to start building that society and understand those things a little bit better. And so I do believe that education is a state's right, and that there should be a degree of local control along with that. I think that there are some curriculum decisions that are more relevant in different areas. Hunting safety is important where I live. It's not so important if you're getting in the Bronx, right? And that's okay. We want those kind of regional differences, and we want communities to get what they believe they need out of their education system. But it has to be done in a way that allows us to find our common humanity and, as a democracy, our common Americanness, which is something that is sorely lacking right now.
Any other questions? Okay, I think this has been great. I love it. And I think we have gotten some ideas that will really help us move forward in our project. So we really appreciate you giving us your time.
Absolutely. This, like I said before, this has been a load of fun. And
Good.
fantastic questions. This has just been a great discussion.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Bye.